Fritz.
We didn't all get to speak.
So first, I apologize to the 30-plus people who didn't get to speak tonight. That's not our usual way of doing things, and I would have stayed here for much longer because I appreciated what each of the people who did speak had to say. You gave us your own personal stories, pro or con, for both sides, and that was very helpful to me. The resolution before us is getting closer to the level playing field that has been aimed for, and I commend Commissioner Novick not only in sticking through this process, but in getting to a majority of the council supporting it. I believe we're closer, but we're not there yet. We have indeed retained some of the essential components of our private for hire standards, for instance, 24/7 service, non-discrimination policies, and the proposal is much better in addressing accessibility, thanks to the task force, particularly Sue Stahl and the Commission on Disabilities, looking at the Portland Equal Access Plan. And instead of a vehicle standard, it's a service standard, and I'm pleased that we're moving forward with that as the first phase in this next phase and not waiting on that. So thank you very much for doing that. It's important to note we have authorized nearly 300 new permits in the past couple of months, and we were set to authorize a few more. I wonder why any taxi company would want to do that at this point with not the level playing field. With folks who have been unhappy with cab service, help is or was on the way. Whether or not the companies who have the authorization for those permits continue to buy the cars, get the permits for the drivers or not, remains to be seen. My main concern, well, I have several main concerns on this, but the one that strikes closest to my heart is the lack of adequate insurance company coverage. It's irresponsible for us to open our citizens up to potentially losing their own and their families' coverage. And it's unconscionable to put drivers on the road with inadequate insurance policies that put the city and the public at risk. 29 weeks ago tomorrow, my husband was killed in a car crash. And the commercial driver that was involved in the crash has yet to accept responsibility, and so I am having to sue. The private driver, who was on his way to work, had relatively good coverage at $300,000 per incident. Unfortunately, 2 people were killed and 2 people were injured in that crash, and so I have yet to receive a penny from that policy because it's a maximum of $100,000 per person, and 400 into 300 doesn't go. So the proposal that's on the table of $50,000 for a death is insulting. And that's with a maximum for the crash of $100,000 is completely inadequate. My friend Carrie Fairchild had hospital bills of more than $100,000 in the incident on September 24th. So I am so sad for the inevitable issues that are going to come up, like the child in San Francisco, where there's going to be arguments about whether the app was on, and there's going to be arguments about what time the crash happened, and where the cars were, and that's not acceptable at all. We also don't know the impact of this experimental period on the livelihood of full-time taxi drivers and on the families that they're supporting. And indeed, the part-time drivers might not be any better off in the long term, since Uber drivers in Seattle were protesting last week about diminished wages they're seeing as a result of Uber's rate slashing practices. Uber sets the rates. So there is the question of, are Uber drivers employers, or are they employees, or are they independent contractors? If it turns out that they are employees, then they will be subject to Portland's sick time law. And I hope that Uber and Lyft are ready to implement that so that those drivers will at least receive some benefits, even though they don't get many. Taxi drivers and local business owners who rely on passenger fares to support their families are more important to me than out-of-state corporations. And frankly, they're more important to me than part-time drivers who don't depend on this way of earning a living. I won't compromise the safety of drivers, passengers, and other road users. There's many more questions that need to be answered. For instance, the fiscal impact of this. We don't know, I mean, there's no projection of what the impact is of decreased funding from the taxi companies. And most business licenses, although it's important to get the business licenses, and I very much appreciate Commissioner Saltzman's amendment, business license taxes don't kick in until you raise until you earn $50,000 in a year. So the shifting of the work to many part-time drivers is going to mean less income for the city, and we should have figured out what that is. I have never been more conscious of my role as the only woman on the council than as part of this debate. The fear that I have that I have been taught since I was a little girl, do not get into cars with strangers. And I very much appreciated the radio cab driver the female driver who talked about the dual cameras in her car and the GPS and the instant radio call and the safeguards for the drivers and the passengers that we have in our current taxi system. So you can bet your bottom dollar that I will continue to be a taxi customer, and I just hope that this deregulation doesn't mean that there won't be adequate taxi coverage for people like me who are never going to get into a stranger's car. I believe we're operating under a false sense of urgency, bowing to the pressures of a particular company, and indeed, as will be seen in the next discussion under the ordinance, that we could be doing this in a more rational and reasoned and thoughtful way that would allow the state insurance to catch up before we implement it, and we're not doing that. By supporting this resolution, I would be endorsing a proposal that is riddled with ambiguity, inequity, and assumptions without the real information that we need to move forward. So unfortunately, I have to vote no.
First, this is a change that none of us wanted. The cab companies didn't want